Hello everybody, welcome back to Chinchilla Ruby. Today I will be making I suppose I could call it a video essay. I'm not going to be editing it, at least not right now. This upload is just going to be me talking. Um, so yeah, because it's still a video, I think I can still call it a video essay, but I may return to it in the future and edit some clips and music to make it a bit more watchable. But the video's topic is going to be about Rhodesia and Zimbabwe, and I'm going to be looking at some books and texts to read criticisms of the governments. All right. Now I had to have some declarations. This is all post-British rule, so I'm not going to be, well, I will very briefly mention history of them under Britain, but for the most part, it's after UDI and the Rhodesian Declaration of Independence. Uh, so yeah, there's also a bit of a debacle on whether to use the term Rhodesian or white Zimbabwean. I'm going to be using Rhodesian as for the most part it's the preferred term by the diaspora community, and well, like 9/10 of the white population would end up leaving Zimbabwe after Mugabe took over, so I'm gonna use Rhodesians for the most part. Of course, for the most part right now, if a white person is in Zimbabwe, they probably call themselves a white Zimbabwean. And I mean, there's probably even a few blacks that would call themselves black Rhodesians in the past, but those people are long gone. Um, and I don't believe they were incredibly numerous in the first place. Don't expect every book here to be very in-depth. Most of them are just going to be very brief, um, explaining what happens and what it has to do with the theme, which is a critique of oppressive power. And yeah, I mean, let's start. Half this video, maybe more, is just going to be history and backdrop. So let's start with the UDI. In 1962, the colonial election, it had a conservative Rhodesian Front victory. I'm going to call them RF because that's their abbreviations. And the more liberal party, UFP, I'm not sure what that stands for. I could have looked it up. But they did not win many voters, and that's because of two main reasons. The first of which was that blacks were not encouraged to vote for them after ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo, was banned. So there's a bit of an intimidation, but blacks were only 10% of the vote anyway. So the more prevalent reason is that the whites in the area were scared of violence and what they called black extremism from the said banned party of ZAPU. So they voted RF, which they thought would do more of a job, more better job protecting them, is what they were thinking of. So it basically would UFP would fade into obscurity after they lost two safe seats under the rebranded name Rhodesia Party. And yeah, for the most part in Rhodesian politics, it's all just RF. And I think that's... I think generally that is just as time progressed, they would see the government in a more positive light and think of like there's an international struggle against and Ian Smith and his government really won over the hearts of the white electorate for the most part. There were a few characters, but they were never popular enough to actually win a seat. I think they would never get more than 40% tops in a race. Um, but yeah. In 1965, Rhodesia declared independence after a colonial government referendum passed with 89% of the vote. It did not achieve international recognition due to the British's policy of no independence before majority rule. Sir Humphrey Gibbs was the colonial governor, and he would protest this action by staying in his government house for 4 years. And he did have aid from supporters who would pay the rent for that house that the government placed on it. And his voters were off, not voters, his supporters, they were usually pretty high ranking officials in like the military or politics, but they weren't numerous enough to try to do anything, as uh, Britain did want them to try to do a bit of a coup, but they didn't have enough support, so they didn't make an attempt. The opponents to UDI included many blacks, communists, and most denomination of Christians, although the Dutch church did not comment on UDI and claimed it was not political, which is an interesting thing to say none the least. But you would see sanctions imposed on Rhodesia after UDI. And also there were a few blockades of ports in Portuguese Mozambique to try to stop things from getting in there. But the U.S. did briefly break sanctions to get some chrome ore, but they did find a new place to source it after a while. And the sanctions were pretty effective. They did strangle Rhodesia. I think in terms of the actual Bush War conflict, if it wasn't for the sanctions, I think the Ian Smith's government probably would have been able to continue it much longer. Um, and the supporters of the new government were South Africa and Portugal. Um, but that leads us to the next part, which is the Bush War, because, not everyone was happy about it, as I mentioned. Even before independence, there were communist forces in the country that were preparing for a guerrilla war to end white rule, and they were probably going to do something regardless of UDI, as they they were getting training from Soviets. ZAPU was ZANU, which came a little bit later. They were supported by the Chinese and a little bit by the North Koreans also, but they're not into picture yet. The first few battles would happen when ZAPU tried to do a pitched conflict, and they lost pretty hard. And then ZANU would act after those battles were lost by doing more like guerrilla warfare and skirmishes, which were more effective. But an escalation would occur in 1972 when ZANLA, which is the ZANU forces, um, the armed branch of ZANU, that is. They crossed into Mozambique, and gained a lot of political support from the populace in Zimbabwe and Mozambique after successfully attacking white farmers. And after this happened, Portugal, Rhodesia, and South Africa, they started they started to work together, but Portugal was spread pretty thin as they were having similar issues in all of their colonies, and they did not want to give any things away, as Portugal considered every bit of land the same as like Portugal proper. They didn't have a colonial system, so they had a port in India, and eventually India just walked into it, and Portugal's like, no, you can't do that. But the UN's like, yeah, you should have known this was gonna happen, Portugal. And yeah, they had some issues. Not a great country to be colonized by either, unless you like death. Probably not the worst, but it's up there. Um, Henry Kissinger, he was an interesting fella, because after they failed to do peace in Victoria Falls, he tried to broker peace, but that also failed. So then they had the Geneva Conference of 1975. Wait, no. That, I'll talk more about the Geneva Conference, but that happened after Kissinger. Um, and overall, all these talks, they basically failed, and the conflict just kept getting more steamy and bloody overall, as both sides, I believe, did tactics which many would consider to be war crime. Um, but yeah, let's talk about how the war is being fought. The goal of the Rhodesian military at the start of the war was to just inflict massive casualties, using what they called fire force, which was basically an airplane of which people would jump out and then surround the guerrilla forces and shoot them from basically all sides. And the tactic was actually very successful at killing people, but the strategy they were using, which involved the tactic, it was not good, because the they didn't solve the issue of people joining the communist forces, and they did not have support of the populace. I believe the whites were only 5% of the population for most of the time of Rhodesia, so they didn't have the numbers to not have the support of the black people in the country. So even though they may have killed way more communist guerrillas than they had deaths, it would be a bad decision to go down that road, if you ask me. The strategy did change after Portugal left the war, because their situation was completely untenable, and also South Africa kind of laid off the support pretty soon after that, because the leader of that country, B.J. Vorster, he had an idea called detente, which he basically wanted to make peace with the communist nations, and obviously, Rhodesia supporting Rhodesia is not gonna, make the president of Zambia want to be your friend. Let's just put it like that. Needless to say, from a political standpoint, it was pretty dumb, if you ask me, because after Zimbabwe, you know, became a country led by Mugabe would be very anti South African. under the apartheid government, more so than any of the previous communist governments, I believe, in the area. So yeah, but let's continue down the history for a second, because the new goal of the Rhodesian government, because they knew the situation was untenable, they were starting to get encircled, and logistics were an issue. The sanctions were starting to catch up on them, and the new goal was to make a new government, which uh, they would negotiate with the more moderate black leaders to form. And this goal actually did succeed, but it also failed. And they created a country called Zimbabwe Rhodesia, which lasted not even a year, as it didn't get international recognition, so it didn't solve any of the problems. And in the end of the Bush War, the government was in $500 million of debt from fighting the guerrillas with the sanctions. And the new Zimbabwe government would be responsible for that debt. But let's talk about Victoria Falls. So in 1975, Ian Smith would meet with delegations from ZAPU, ZANU, the UANC, and Frolizzi. B.J. Forrester, which was the leader of South Africa, and Kenneth Kaunda, which was the leader of Zambia, were the mediators. And I'm gonna break down the parties and what their goals were at this at Victoria Falls. Ian Smith, he knew Rhodesia wouldn't be winning at this point. B.J. Forrester was already uh, this was his big first attempt at detente, and he knew the tides of the war was not in their favor. So while he did want to make a peace here, he also didn't want to give much up, because at this point in the war, he still thought they were winning. Um, so he didn't want to. What he wanted was a very overrepresentation of whites in the government, and he wanted to punish um, dissidents, um, of which, he's talking to these dissidents, and I'm not really sure what he was going for there, because you don't just tell someone you want to send them to jail after the peace deal. Obviously, this was not going to work, and I feel like this is probably one of the biggest blunders under Ian Smith. I think in the later negotiations, he did much better, but in this one, he didn't do so hot. But obviously, B.J. Vorster, he had his new policy, and he thought he could get political gains and get the heat off South Africa. And South Africa, their apartheid policies were considerably worse than the discrimination in Rhodesia, if you ask me. Of course, I'm not going to say Rhodesia was some saint place. Ian Smith probably would, but more on that later. Kenneth Kaunda was the president of communist Zambia. He was a very prominent figure. He supported ZAPU and ZANU and wanted to see a black-led Zimbabwe. And then the four rebel guerrilla groups, the ZAPU, ZANU, UNC, and Frolizzi, they gave three things they wanted to see, and if he agreed to those, Ian Smith, if he agreed, then more work could have been done. They wanted one man, one vote. They wanted political immunity, and they wanted their exiled leaders to return to the country to, prepare for the presidential and electoral races. Um, Obviously, he did not agree to the second point, so the talks kind of broke down. And ZAPU was led by Robert Mugabe. ZANU was led by Joshua Nkomo. The UANC was led by Bishop Abel Murazawa. And I don't remember who Frolizzi was led by, but they're kind of irrelevant. That by time the election, the first election of Zimbabwe happened, they did not manage to get a single seat, much to the dismay of the leader. But yeah, in the second round of talks, they kicked out Mugabe and ZANU and continued anyway. ZAPU was talking with Kenneth Konda because he's like, oh, I don't know if I want to continue. Is this okay, or will ZANU be mad with us? And he's like, yeah, you can continue. But yeah, it, for the most part, in the first talk, it was just political ramblings after Ian Smith did not agree to the second point. But in the future days, there was differing accounts. Ian Smith said he had a good time talking with them, I believe, but they did not feel the same warm atmosphere, and obviously it was not enough to lead to a new government. Which leads us to Kissinger's proposal in 1976. He wanted to broker a peace deal, so he got the presidents of Zambia and Tanzania to agree to a 2-year transition period of black rule. It was also supported by B.J. Vorster, which basically said, if you don't accept these terms, we're cutting off all your supplies, Rhodesia. And they did agree to the terms, but by time they did so, the Zambian and Tanzanian presidents changed their mind. So the Geneva Conference of 1976 was held because they wanted to try to salvage this. ZAPU and ZANU would attend as one delegation known as PF, Patriotic Front. The PF delegates did not discuss terms with the Rhodesian delegates, and it was mostly just stories about their plight and history, so not a lot got done at the Geneva Conference. Mugabe once arrived late one day, and the Rhodesian delegate wanted him to apologize, so he just got mad and yelled at the dude. And after the failure, a statement was made by the PF delegates that the Brits were conspiring with Rhodesia to keep them down. Now, obviously, I don't think that's true. I think that conference was a mess. If you look into it, there was one of the PF members got cold in his room, so he turned on all the kitchen things like an oven and the stove to warm up the place, and he ended up burning down the bedroom, and he jumped out the window in his pajamas. Allegedly, I wasn't there, but man, yeah, that was a mess. Obviously, it didn't work. So they continued fighting, and eventually there was a moderate government, Zimbabwe Rhodesia, um, in an attempt to win international support. The UDI government made a deal with the UNAC, mainly under Bishop Murzawa, and I think Frolizzi might have been part of it also, but I'm not sure. They're kind of a minor force. they were never that prevalent. But the government was largely set up like the previous UDI government, but the voting requirements were changed. Blacks had the majority vote. Abel Murazawa was the prime minister, but it didn't get international support, so they basically gave up on uh, um, fighting the communists, and they agreed to have open elections. And this deal was brokered, called the Lancaster House Agreement. Um, it happened in late 1974. It had 47 sessions take place to write the new constitution and then negotiate peace. The UK would be the administrator of the country until the elections were held. The elections of 1980 saw ZANU win the outright majority of the electorate. RF voters were hopeful that the UNAC would get enough votes to stop this, but they only got 8% of the vote. And that's the black vote. They did separate the white and the black votes and also electorates, but the whites only had 20 seats, so there's not much they could do with that. Um, Lord Soames, which was the overseer of this, he would accuse ZANU of intimidating voters, but nothing really came of this. The international community didn't really care, or they thought maybe a little bit, but not enough to warrant intervention. Uh, ZAPU won in the Ndebele areas, and I believe Abel Murazawa denied the results, but he mostly faded to obscurity after this. He did want to run for other elections in the future, but they were rigged, spoilers, so he didn't really end up running because there was no point. And yeah, that's the gist of Rhodesian history. Obviously, there's quite a lot of flavor you're missing out. So maybe go scour some Wikipedia pages for yourself. Maybe read some accounts of people there. As as Ian Smith, he had memoirs among many prominent communist members would also write about their experiences during this time. So there's a lot you can read about if you want to. Now, obviously, ZANU wanted to run ZAPU and ZANU together as a one patriotic front party, but ZAPU refused to do that, which led to some issues in Zimbabwe, which we'll get to. But let's talk about some books during this period. The first one I want to talk about is called Nervous Conditions. This book is an interesting book. It's written about a young girl named Tambu, and it's her coming of age story. It's the first in a trilogy, and I'll be mentioning a little bit about the other books in that trilogy as well. The primary dynamic in this book, in which Rhodesia is talked about, is when Baba Murkuru was an affluent minister, and he had a rebellious daughter named Nyasha, and throughout the book you'll see them drift apart over ideology, and also she kind of was, it's not a phase, Dad. But Baba Murkuru was Tambu's uncle, and he was also kind of the head of the family, the extended family, as he's the one with the wealth, and her father would always listen to him. Now, at the start of the book, Tambu had very similar views to him because she saw him in such a high opinion, and she really wanted to be like him and get her education. But she does get a bit more cynical as the book goes on, and also the trilogy especially. But at the start of the book, Baba Murkuru would refer to the communist forces as terrorists, and he did not like them one bit. And he did support the UDI government of Rhodesia, and had many friends and acquaintances that were whites. Meanwhile, his daughter, she really supported the communists and wanted the white people to leave Zimbabwe. And I don't think I can mention too much about her because, and like why she might think that, because she did have some serious mental issues in the book. And if I tried to like connect those two things together, it'd be like, oh, you'd have to be mentally dull to support the communists, which is not really what I'm going for here, and I don't think that's true necessarily. Um, but yeah, the real meat of this book I consider is Tambu, and how as the book progresses, she starts to be more cynical to everyone's views and starts to think for herself. She doesn't really see, Rhodesia as some sort of saint fighting against the evil communist terrorists, but she doesn't necessarily support the communists either. And I think this goes back to Fire Force and the strategy at the start of the Bush War. Um, the Rhodesian government really failed to win the hearts and the minds of the Shona and the Ndebele people, and instead, focused on the safety of themselves. And I think that was uh, their main drawback. I feel like if they really focused on the prosperity of the blacks in the country and didn't see everyone as like a potential enemy, I think they could have. Um, I think would have been better for them, a better strategy. That's my opinion on that. And it really goes to show how at the start of the war, Zanu and Zapu did not have an incredible amount of support from the people that they wanted to liberate, as they put it. But as the war dragged on, despite taking massive casualties, they would actually grow in number because they just kept getting more support. Yeah. So the Book of Not. This is the sequel to the book. And you would see the war and discrimination, they're far more visible in this book than the previous. Tambu would have family members hurt in a mine that was planted by communist guerrillas, I believe. Um, she also experienced discrimination at school and at work, mostly in school, as work was very short at the end of the book. But I think this book is significant as it further shows the failures of the Rhodesian system to integrate society and end the racial conflict. It also showed off some of the intimidation tactics that the guerrillas used on Baba Murkuru because they thought he was getting a little too close to the whites. Um, a Son of the Soil. This is an interesting book. The protagonist, Alexio, he details his story growing up and trying to get an education. He He keeps failing, though, due to police suspicions that they think he's a dissident, and also a bit of racism thrown in there. Uh, this leads him to actually becoming a guerrilla fighter because of how, targeted he felt. And later, the author Wilson Kadia would write a book called Siga, T. Siga, in which he writes about the betrayal of the new black leadership he fought for. Um, I find this book significant because it shows, how it shows exactly how the Rhodesian government failed, um, and it showed how it was driving people to become more communist as the war dragged on. Um, uh, the House of Hunger. This is an interesting book. I believe it talks a little bit about Zimbabwe and Rhodesia, but I'm gonna throw it in the Rhodesian book section anyway. This book it represents the hunger that Zimbabwe's had for their own state. But the actual content in the book, if you're not looking at broad strokes, it gets pretty wild. Because one scene is the protagonist's mother telling the protagonist a story. Protagonist because he's not named, as far as I know. Maybe they throw it in some random passage I skipped. But his mother was telling him a story of how she became a prostitute for white people after she got kicked out of her home for getting pregnant at 12. So, yeah, very dramatic, I'll say. Um, but the writing is also very metaphorical because it uses stains as a way of getting its point across. So, if you really are into that wild stuff that goes on in the world, maybe give it a read. Unless you got like the literacy of a 3-year-old. I don't know what a metaphor is. No. But Zimbabwe, we're finally here. They're independent. They just had their election. I'm gonna be talking about some of the history of Zimbabwe before I go back to talking about the books. And I do believe I have a good selection to talk about also, so stay tuned. The Ndebele Genocide, more commonly known as the Gukurahondi. I don't want to pronounce that further, so I'm going to call it the Ndebele Genocide. It was a crackdown and genocide of Ndebele dissidents. They used torture, rape, murder, re-education camps. It was pretty bad. These were all very common tactics used at the time. In 1980, a wave of unrest hit Bulawayo, and in 1982, the government started cracking down on ZAPU leaders. The ones led by Joshua Nkomo. They had support of the Soviet Union, though Mugabe also did, but they were more aligned with the Chinese earlier in the war. But this would lead to violence and desertions. In the end, somewhere between 8,000 and 300,000 were killed. 300,000 seems like a bit much, but yeah. The Unity Accord would give amnesties to dissidents and war criminals. And while the genocide is acknowledged today, many do not feel the government is sincere when they apologize about it. Now, there were some strikes in the 90s. After the election of 1990, where ZANU-PF won 83% of the vote, probably not legally, or you know what I mean. Probably not a fair and open election. I don't know why I'm saying probably, but there were some strikes, and not much would come of it. But this goes to show the problems in the country started to accumulate because the people were not happy with their salaries, and there was also a major HIV epidemic going on. So that's the reason people went to the streets to protest. But also in this time period, land redistribution started happening. In the late 90s, ZANU PF, uh, ZANU PF is, I, it's basically ZANU, but they basically bullied ZAPU into folding in order to end the genocide. He basically had a gun to their head, metaphorically. So they returned to the issue of land reform, and while there was a pre-existing system for consensual land reform, uh, and it was all paid for by the British, it didn't deliver enough results, and ZANU PF wanted things to move along a little faster because 80% of the good farmland was still owned by white people at the time. In 1997, the government published a list of farms it intended to buy, though some would leave or enter that list by time the fast track program, which is what they called the redistribution, would happen. Britain did not support the policy and did not pay for these redistributions. Some international countries supported the policy, and obviously ex-guerrillas and urban elites that wanted some of that land, uh, they supported it also. In 2000, a referendum was held to see if the public would support the government seizing the land without compensation. Despite media support, the referendum failed with 55% of the vote going against it. This did not stop the government, not at all. They started marching on farms. Initially, it was just intimidation with drums and parades, but it soon got very violent. Some white farmers would die, usually after an exchange of gunfire. But what was more common is they would just kill the laborers at the farm and force the white people out. The laborers were usually local residents that had no other means of making money besides the farm. Neither the farmers or the workers would be compensated. Some courts did sometimes favor the parties that were afflicted after particularly corrupt seizures happened, but they don't really have the power to get the people their land back in those cases. In 2005, the Zimbabwe government would nationalize land in a 99-year lease system. This is similar to what the Chinese have, and the SADC tribunal would rule against it, but the response was just Zimbabwe leaving the SADC. The new owners of the land did not have land titles, so they failed to get loans from many banks because they didn't have collateral. And yeah. There were two main studies done on this redistribution. One claimed that it was corrupt, and one said it was mostly fair. The latter, the IDS study, was criticized for only looking at a small portion of land. I'm unsure of how the ANC liaison study operated, of which the ANC being the leading party of South Africa, modern South Africa. Also a little corrupt, but not as bad as Mugabe. The impact of this policy was that Zimbabwe went from being the breadbasket of Africa to being very prone famine. Cash crops also took a hit. though by now everything's running like it used to, and they have pretty okay harvests. Um, there would be economic collapse and inflation as after land reform, the US and the EU would impose sanctions on Zimbabwe. Now, the EU sanctions were removed in 2019, but the US sanctions are still going on today. The inflation crisis started in 1998 with a 32% inflation rate, but by 2007, the economic crisis got so bad that the formal unemployment rate was at 80%. In 2009, they just gave up on their currency and started trading in more stable currencies like the euro, dollar, even like I think they used the currency of Peru even, or maybe Chile. But still, they very unorganized. But it's what you had to do at that point due to how devalued the currency was. In 2016, the country's economy had basically collapsed, and there were mass protests. Operation Murambetsivina was the act of forcefully clearing out slums in 2005. The UN estimates at least 700K people were affected, and it was very political, and they were punishing voters of the new MDC party, and the Western nations condemned this action. Also, the MDC party, it's largely agreed that they won the popular vote, but then the results were withheld, so the ZANU PF would just rig it. So that's a fun little bit of history. The 2013 Constitution was held after a referendum to enact new constitutional bits and pieces, which include term limits and allowed dual citizenship. 94.5% of the votes were in favor of the Constitution, though notably it did not count the terms Mugabe already served. There was a coup in 2017. It had the backing of the military. Emerson Mnangagwa took control of the capital and had Mugabe impeached. The military turned on Mugabe because he started replacing the older war veterans in the positions of power with younger people. And Mugabe would not last much longer after this anyway, and he died. So he's not around today. But today the government's still led by Emerson Mnangagwa. It's the same corrupt ZANU PF party in charge, but it is much more liberal. They started a program to give white farmers back their land if it was seized back in the day, and they would compensate the new owners of the land with either money or different land. The government also wants to rejoin the British Commonwealth, and was also responsible for ending the EU sanctions. So much better than Mugabe, but still not the kind of party that you want to rule your nation. Now, let's talk about books. The first book is called This Mournable Body. This is the third in the trilogy in which Tambu leaves her first job, and she would get a new job as a teacher. But she ends up assaulting a student after she starts getting resentment because of how easy the students have it and how like calm they are and aren't grateful or whatever. She would meet a few white people in the book, and yeah, these would generally be like foreigners, I believe, that hold themselves in high regard. They're like, "Oh, we could do so much for this country," and yeah, that's a bit cringe if you ask me, putting it like that. Um, but the significance of this book is how people did not have closure after the independence of Zimbabwe from Rhodesia, and Yeah, people like Tambu really were messed up. Now we're at probably the most controversial book I have. It's called Bitter Harvest. Now this is basically just an altered version of The Great Betrayal, memoirs of Ian Douglas Smith. So if you wanted an authentic version, look up that. But Bitter Harvest is just a slightly edited version where some British person put a foreword and an afterword, I believe, um, which I didn't read those. Rip bozo. Uh, Most of this book is just defending his actions as leader of Rhodesia. I'm going to be ignoring those chapters, but on chapter 23, titled The Life Under Mugabe, gets pretty interesting. So, right after independence, Ian uh, he thought the conflicts, the Ndebele genocide, which he referred to them as the Matabele, which is, I believe, the more commonly used historic name by many British people. Though obviously now, if you look up like what they call themselves, it's the Ndebeles. But he basically saw this conflict coming right after independence. He thought Mugabe wanted a one-party state, and the whole Zapu-Zanu split was not going to be tolerated. And he thought Mugabe was orchestrating the whole thing. Um, Now he would talk to Mugabe at the start of this chapter, and he was much calmer than he was in previous talks. Of course, later talks, he'd just think, not really calm, just indifferent to what I'm saying. But that was a change, as Mugabe used to be very hot-headed. Though after he said that he might not support the government if they continue down the road of extreme communism. Mugabe no longer wanted to speak to Ian, so that was the last time they met. He talked about Mugabe using media as intimidation and blackmail on whites and Ndebeles. The book does get a bit sussy when Ian says that UDI was an act of anti-imperialism and the blacks in Rhodesia had more freedom than any country in Africa. Which, I wish, Ian, I wish, but I don't know about that one. He makes the claim that Mugabe was trying to turn the Ndebeles and the whites on each other with covert operations. He talked about how the new police appointed by the government abused their powers to gather statements, unlawfully imprison people. Merzarawa would declare similar abuse on the BBC, but Ian Smith estimated about 30K would die in the genocide. And that the political struggle would continue for many years. He would then mention the devaluation of the currency and the plans to redistribute white land. He would talk about food shortages which came about and economic issues in the early 90s. He mentioned in 1992 the defense budget went up 10 times. The chapter ends with him criticizing Mugabe's lavish lifestyle and living off the taxes of the poor. Wait, isn't that a communist talking point? Oh my God, Ian. No. But, switch sides, I guess. But, the next chapter is about the 1995 elections. The elections blatantly rigged. The opposition withdrew. The opposition being Bishop Murazawa and Sitole. and they knew it was rigged, so they're like, why even bother? But they did continue the election anyway to waste people's tax dollars, I guess. But yeah. He also mentioned self-proclaimed freedom fighters once murdering black British humanitarians. He would go on a tangent about history and how ZANU intimidated people in the election at Lancaster House. We talk about how reactionaries would get kicked out of the the RF party led by him. And as far as I know, that is true, which is one of the differences between Rhodesia and South Africa under apartheid. As if you were a reactionary in South Africa, you'd probably be applauded during the apartheid government. Um, the chapter ends with him asking the reader to give their support to Nelson Mandela, and he does finish the book with a chapter about his wife, which that's cute, but I kind of skipped that chapter, didn't read it. Maybe one day. This book is very rich in history, though definitely biased. I think he really had exaggerations on how well the blacks had it. Um, and I don't think he was blatantly lying. I think he generally believed it. He was just out of touch, is my guess. I think that if it really was like that, history would have went a lot better. And yeah, he's much more critical of ZANU and particularly Mugabe than any of the other black nationalists in Zimbabwe, which I kind of agree with even before I read this. So yeah, he did meet Joshua Nkomo uh, during the preludes to the genocide, to which Nakoma was basically like, no, we just need to be patient. These things will work themselves out. I'm sure. I'm sure he felt a little disappointed on how things went. Um, but yeah, I mean, yeah, he stopped a civil war from happening by doing that, maybe. So yeah, time to talk about the next book. It's called We Need New Names. This is about a girl named Darling from Bulawayo. She has a chance to live in the U.S. And leave the violent regime in Zimbabwe. The novel uses a child's perspective to criticize things like colonialism, adultery, AIDS, incest, and rape. Once in the U.S., she feels disappointed and compares herself to a prisoner that's being trapped. And I think it's notable mostly for the criticisms that she expresses as a child. The next book is called Running with Mother. This is a story about a girl who has forces arrive in her village to kill the Ndebele people. Luckily for her, the protagonist, her mother is Shona. Her family and friends are not as lucky. They die. Not much to say about this, but if you really like reading about horrible tragedies, maybe give it a read, as it includes those. Now, another thing I wanted to talk about is Count Mahalanga. Probably pronounced that wrong, but this was an interesting fellow. I didn't actually get to read any of his books because I can't find them. This dude's like very hard to come by his books, at least on the internet. Maybe you can find them in Goodwill. I haven't checked. But I threw him in here because if you want to check out some books and don't mind searching the ends of the earth, give him a look. He looks very interesting, like physically. Like, give a look at the dude on Google Images. He has a very interesting history. Maybe check out his Wikipedia page. But yeah, it is a bit of a shame because he died not even a year ago. So rest in peace, Count Mahalanga. Yeah, his books did seem interesting though. Time for some closing statements. So when I started this, I also wanted to cover the constitutions, the three being Rhodesian UDI, as well as the 1979 and the 2013 amendments to the Constitution. Due to time and scope constraints, I'm not doing that. But if I return to this video to edit it, I might cover those. And while this is very tragic, generally, um, mm, there's definitely every time you think something good might come, it just doesn't. It gets worse. Um, that's what I think about this. I don't think it had to be that way. I think the main, the biggest way to fix this history, if we're going down alt histories, I think Rhodesia really needed to change their political strategy. And if that happened, then we might have seen a prosperous Zimbabwe, but we're not living in that. There are some up and coming elections in Zimbabwe this year, which I'm a bit excited to see. They're probably going to be rigged. The commission was already caught trying to rig it once already, so I think that the chances of it being free and open and fair are a bit slim. But um, yeah, I mean, I don't have too much more to say. I feel like if Mugabe wanted Blackstone the farmland, I feel like they should have just taken a page out of Paraguay's book. If you know, you know. But make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment if you disagree with me, as I might cover that comment in a future edited video. Yeah, I mean, yeah, no one was really in the right here, as far as I'm concerned. Very rough history. A real shame if you ask me. Yeah, like and subscribe.